The national and state election is Tuesday, November 5th. Polls open at 7 a.m. and close at 8 p.m. On the ballot for federal office are electors for U.S. President, Senator, and Representative in Congress. Statewide, there are elections for state senator, state representative, and the Governor's Council. For Barnstable County, there are elections for the Clerk of Courts, Register of Deeds, County Commissioner, Assembly of Delegates, and Upper Cape Regional School Committee. There are 6 ballot questions. In an effort to keep our community informed, FCTV offers those questions here in their entirety. Ballot question number 1. Law proposed by initiative petition. State auditor's authority to audit the legislature. This proposed law would specify that the state auditor has the authority to audit the legislature. A yes vote would specify that the state auditor has the authority to audit the legislature. A no vote would make no change in the law relative to the state auditor's authority. Ballot question number 2. Law proposed by initiative petition. Elimination of MCAS as high school graduation requirement. This proposed law would eliminate the requirements that a student pass the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, MCAS, tests, or other statewide or district-wide assessments in mathematics, science, and technology and English in order to receive a high school diploma. Instead, in order for a student to receive a high school diploma, the proposed law would require the student to complete coursework certified by the student's district as demonstrating mastery of the competencies contained in the state academic standards in mathematics, science and technology, and English, as well as any additional areas determined by the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. A yes vote would eliminate the requirements that students pass the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, MCAS, in order to graduate high school, but still require students to complete coursework that meets state standards. A no vote would make no change in the law relative to the requirements that a student pass the MCAS in order to graduate high school. Ballot question number 3. Law proposed by initiative petition. Unionization for transportation network drivers. Do you approve of a law summarized below on which no vote was taken by the Senate or the House of Representatives before May 1st, 2024. The proposed law would provide transportation network drivers, with the right to form unions, driver organizations, to collectively bargain with transportation network companies, which are companies that use a digital network to connect riders to drivers for prearranged transportation, to create negotiated recommendations concerning wages, benefits, and terms and conditions of work. Drivers would not be required to engage in any union activities. Companies would be allowed to form multi-company associations to represent them when negotiating with driver organizations. The state would supervise the labor activities permitted by the proposed law and would have responsibility for approving or disapproving the negotiated recommendations. The proposed law would define certain activities by a company or a driver organization to be unfair work practices. The proposed law would establish a hearing process for the State Employment Relations Board to follow when a company or driver organization is charged with an unfair work practice. The proposed law would permit the board to take action, including awarding compensation to adversely affected drivers, if it found that an unfair work practice had been committed. The proposed law would provide for an appeal of a board decision to the state appeals court. This proposed law also would establish a procedure for determining which drivers are active drivers, meaning that they completed more than the median number of rides in the previous 6 months. The proposed law would establish procedures for the board to determine that a driver organization has signed authorizations from at least 5% of active drivers, entitling the driver organization to a list of active drivers, to designate a driver organization as the exclusive bargaining representative for all drivers based on signed authorizations from at least 25% of active drivers, to resolve disputes over exclusive bargaining status, including through elections, and to decertify a driver organization from exclusive bargaining status. A driver organization that has been designated the exclusive bargaining representative would have the exclusive right to represent the drivers and to receive voluntary membership dues deductions. Once the board determined that a driver organization was the exclusive bargaining representative for all drivers, the company would be required to bargain with that driver organization concerning wages, benefits, and terms and conditions of work. Once the driver organization and companies reached agreement on wages, benefits, and the terms and conditions of work, that agreement would be voted upon by all drivers who have completed at least 100 trips the previous quarter. If approved by a majority of votes cast, the recommendations would be submitted to the State Secretary of Labor for approval and, if approved, would be effective for 3 years. The proposed law would establish procedures for the mediation and arbitration if the driver organization and companies failed to reach agreement within a certain period of time. An arbitrator would consider factors set forth in the proposed law, including whether the wages of drivers would be enough so that drivers would not need to rely upon any public benefits. The proposed law also sets out procedures for the Secretary of Labor's review and approval of recommendations negotiated by a driver organization and the companies, and for judicial review of the Secretary's decision. The proposed law states that neither its provisions, an agreement, nor a determination by the Secretary would be able to lessen labor standards established by other laws. If there were any conflict between the proposed law and existing Massachusetts labor relations law, the proposed law would prevail. The board would make rules and regulations as appropriate to effectuate the proposed law. The proposed law states that if any of its parts were declared invalid, the other parts would stay in effect. A yes vote would provide transportation network drivers the option to form unions to collectively bargain with transportation network companies regarding wages, benefits, and terms and conditions of work. A no vote would make no change in the law relative to the ability of transportation network drivers to form unions. Ballot question number 4. Law proposed by initiative petition. Limited legalization and regulation of certain natural psychedelic substances. Do you approve of a law summarized below on which no vote was taken by the Senate or the House of Representatives before May 1st, 2024? This proposed law would allow persons aged 21 and older to grow, possess, and use certain natural psychedelic substances in certain circumstances. The psychedelic substances allowed would be 2 substances found in mushrooms, psilocybin and psilocin, and 3 substances found in plants, dimethyltryptamine, mescaline, and ibogaine. These substances could be purchased at an approved location for use under the supervision of a licensed facilitator. This proposed law would otherwise prohibit any retail sale of natural psychedelic substances. This proposed law would also provide for the regulation and taxation of these psychedelic substances. This proposed law would license and regulate facilities offering supervised use of these psychedelic substances and provide for the taxation of proceeds from those facilities' sales of psychedelic substances. It would also allow persons aged 21 and older to grow these psychedelic substances in a 12-foot by 12-foot area at their home and to use these psychedelic substances at their home. This proposed law would authorize persons aged 21 or older to possess up to 1 gram of psilocybin, 1 gram of psilocin, 1 gram of dimethyltryptamine, 18 grams of mescaline, and 30 grams of ibogaine personal use amount, in addition to whatever they might grow at their home, and to give away up to the personal use amount to a person aged 21 or over. This proposed law would create a Natural Psychedelic Substances Commission of 5 members appointed by the Governor, Attorney General, and Treasurer, which would administer the law governing the use and distribution of these psychedelic substances. The Commission would adopt regulations governing licensing, qualifications, security, record-keeping, education and training, health and safety requirements, testing, and age verification. This proposed law would also create a Natural Psychedelic Substances Advisory Board of 20 members appointed by the Governor, Attorney General, and Treasurer, which would study and make recommendations to the Commission on the regulation and taxation of these psychedelic substances. This proposed law would allow cities and towns to reasonably restrict the time, place, and manner of the operation of licensed facilities offering psychedelic substances, but cities and towns could not ban those facilities or their provision of these substances. The proceeds of sales of psychedelic substances at licensed facilities would be subject to the state sales tax and an additional excise tax of 15%. In addition, a city or town could impose a separate tax of up to 2%. Revenue received from the additional state excise tax, license application fees, and civil penalties for violations of this proposed law would be deposited in a Natural Psychedelic Substances Regulation Fund and would be used, subject to appropriation, for administration of this proposed law. Using the psychedelic substances as permitted by this proposed law could not be a basis to deny a person medical care or public assistance, impose discipline by a professional licensing board, or enter adverse orders in child custody cases, absent clear and convincing evidence that the activities created an unreasonable danger to the safety of a minor child. This proposed law would not affect existing laws regarding the operation of motor vehicles while under the influence, or the ability of employers to enforce workplace policies restricting the consumption of these psychedelic substances by employees. This proposed law would allow property owners to prohibit the use, display, growing, processing, or sale of these psychedelic substances on their premises. State and local governments could continue to restrict the possession and use of these psychedelic substances in public buildings or at schools. The proposed law would take effect on December 15, 2024. A yes vote would allow persons over age 21 to use certain natural psychedelic substances under licensed supervision and to grow and possess limited quantities of those substances in their home, and would create a commission to regulate those substances. A no vote would make no change in the law regarding natural psychedelic substances. Ballot question number 5. Law proposed by initiative petition, minimum wage for tipped workers. Do you approve of a law summarized below on which no vote was taken by the Senate and the House of Representatives before May 1st, 2024? This proposed law would gradually increase the minimum hourly wage an employer must pay a tipped worker over the course of 5 years on the following schedule: to 64% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2025, to 73% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2026, to 82% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2027, to 91% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2028, and to 100% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2029. The proposed law would require employers to continue to pay tipped workers the difference between the state minimum wage and the total amount of a tipped worker receives in hourly wages plus tips through the end of 2028. The proposed law would also permit employers to calculate the difference over the entire weekly or biweekly payroll period. The requirement to pay this difference would cease when the required hourly wage for tipped workers would become 100% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2029. Under the proposed law, if an employer pays its workers an hourly wage that is at least the state minimum wage, the employer would be permitted to administer a tip pool that combines all the tips given by customers to tipped workers and distributes them among all the workers, including non-tipped workers. A yes vote would increase the minimum hourly wage an employer must pay a tipped worker to the full state minimum wage implemented over 5 years, at which point employers would pool all tips and distribute them to all non-management workers. A no vote would make no change in the law governing tip pooling or the minimum wage for tipped workers. Ballot question number 6. Law proposed by initiative petition. Do you approve of the amendments to the Barnstable County Charter summarized below? The revisions to the Barnstable County Charter proposed by the Assembly of Delegates amend the fiscal provisions of the Charter to codify the Assembly of Delegates Standing Committee on Finance and define its powers and duties, expressly authorize the Assembly of Delegates to increase, decrease, add, or omit items to the annual budget proposed by the Board of Regional Commissioners, expressly authorize submission of supplemental budget requests by the Board of Regional Commissioners, and expressly authorize any member of the Assembly of Delegates or the Board of Regional Commissioners to introduce a request for a supplemental appropriation ordinance after the adoption of the county's fiscal year operating budget, while requiring those ordinances to provide the specific means for defraying the appropriations therein contained. The election is Tuesday, November 5th. Polls open at 7 a.m. and close at 8 p.m.